Thank you, Amir. Good day, everyone. My name is Marrie Schmidt, and I'm a researcher at Cochrane South Africa at the South African Medical Research Council. And today's webinar will be following on from last month's that Sara presented on formulating and reviewing a question for a qualitative evidence synthesis. So the objectives of today's webinar are threefold. Firstly, to understand the different stages in conducting a qualitative evidence synthesis. So this is really to understand the methods. Secondly, to understand how executing these stages differs to the stages of systematic reviews of interventions or of effectiveness. And thirdly, to learn about useful resources that can guide the conduct of qualitative evidence syntheses. So I just thought that it would be a good idea to start off with a brief recap from last month's webinar. And for me, I think the 4 take-home messages from that webinar were firstly, that qualitative evidence synthesis questions are diverse. And we learned that they explore beyond just perceptions and experiences. So they also provide explanations and they help us to build new theories related to a particular phenomenon of interest. Secondly, qualitative evidence synthesis questions can change and evolve. And this happens especially during the early stages of the review process. This process is usually iterative, creative, flexible, and can be therefore very time-consuming. Fourthly, there are different frameworks that can guide the way that we frame and focus a qualitative evidence synthesis question. So before I proceed with the rest of the stages of how to conduct a qualitative evidence synthesis, I'd just like to ask you that you please make suggestions in the chat box as to what you think the next 2 steps are once you have actually finalized your review question. So just again to ask if you could please make suggestions in the chat box as to what you think the next 2 steps are for conducting a qualitative evidence synthesis once you have actually finalized your review question. Okay, thank you for the suggestions. There's one that is coming up, which is protocol development. That's quite right. And also earlier on, someone suggested something related to inclusion and exclusion criteria. So where I'm trying to take us is really to the sort of next stage of preparing the review, which entails registering the title of the review and also developing the protocol. So why is registering the title of a qualitative evidence synthesis important? And the reasons for doing so are actually quite some systematic reviews of effectiveness. So I've just listed 4 reasons here that I would like to share with you. Firstly, registration is important because it allows us to avoid duplication. So there are other researchers working in the same field who are potentially interested in the same question or similar question to what you're asking. One of them, synthesis, is to try and reduce research waste. So by actually registering the review, we ensure that there aren't researchers working in different contexts who are actually duplicating work. Secondly, through registration, we promote transparency. And this is really in terms of transparency of what your review question is, but also in terms of transparency around the composition of your review team. So this is really about the openness of the content and the methodological expertise on your review team. Then thirdly, title registration also allows us to be able to sort of spell out and think about what kind of methodological or technical support we require during the review process. And it's also an initial stage of peer review. And then lastly, journals are requiring the registration of review questions in order to publish protocols. And so, especially with qualitative evidence syntheses, where the methods are still evolving, it's really important to register the question in order to get feedback on sampling, analysis, and synthesis approaches. So it's really a way to provide others with a BMC systematic reviews, except protocol synthesis. But there are probably other journals that are now considering qualitative evidence synthesis protocols as well. So it's always good to shop around and ask editors if they're interested in publishing your protocol. And then in terms of where one can actually register the title of a qualitative evidence synthesis, I've listed 4 places here. So Cochrane is one place, and usually this is done with a suitable review group. Prospero is popular for non-Cochrane qualitative evidence syntheses. Epicenter and Campbell Collaboration are also other places to register. So I've just provided the links here, and you're more than welcome to learn more about their registration processes. Another thing to consider when starting a qualitative evidence synthesis is also who will be involved in conducting the review, or who will be involved in actually guiding the review. And this is in terms of the authors, whether you want to establish an advisory board, whether there are internal peer review processes that need to take place before the review can be submitted for publication, and also key stakeholders that one might want to involve in the review. And the first aspect that I really want to highlight for qualitative evidence synthesis has to do with the selection of methodologists on the qualitative evidence synthesis. So compared to systematic reviews of interventions or effectiveness, there are generally fewer researchers who have training and practical experience in conducting qualitative evidence synthesis. And this is simply because this is a newer method. And so methodologists on the team can comprise of researchers who have conducted systematic reviews of effectiveness before. And these are really the people who understand the systematic approach. It can also comprise of researchers who have conducted primary qualitative research before. So these are people who understand qualitative methods really well. So they've conducted some sort of primary qualitative research before. But methodologists on a QES don't have to be people who have both skill sets. So it's always good to try and strike a balance. So for example, with Sara and I, we are currently working on 2 qualitative evidence syntheses. And we try and strike a balance between having systematic and qualitative skills in the review team, with Sara having a strong skill set in conducting primary qualitative research, and I having experience in conducting systematic reviews of effectiveness. So we try and make up for the systematic and qualitative skills in that manner. The second aspect that I want to highlight has to do with the selection of stakeholder representatives. Sometimes stakeholders involved in the review are those people who are commissioned to do the review. But there's also a growing field called integrated knowledge translation, where researchers are encouraged to get evidence into policy and practice by actually exchanging end users, such as by engaging end users such as patients, clinicians, policymakers, and others in some capacity in the research activities. And as presented in last month's webinar, qualitative evidence synthesis aimed to answer questions related to equity, acceptability, and feasibility. So there might be other people outside of us researchers who are better positioned to guide specific elements of the review that pertain to these issues. And these people can really help us then identify and outline outcomes, or they can guide us to suitable grey literature and so forth. So we've looked at developing a review question. We've looked at title registration and the importance of publishing the protocol. And we've also looked at setting up a review team that extends beyond just the authors. So in the next stage of a qualitative evidence synthesis is the literature search. And I think the first thing that I want to highlight here is that it's important to document the stage of the process of actually developing the search strategy. Usually a preliminary search strategy would have been included in the protocol. So I'm really just here wanting to highlight factors related to finalizing the strategy and conducting the search. And in QES, finalizing the search strategy is often an iterative process. And this iterative process can mean that we use known studies that meet the inclusion of the review that we've identified during the protocol stage to further clarify our search strategy. These known studies can be searched for amongst the hits or amongst the search records, and then used to identify new keywords or terms that are not already included in the search strategy. And this exercise can take place in iterations until the reviewers are confident that they have a comprehensive and exhaustive search strategy. And this is usually the case in qualitative evidence syntheses because we don't have validated methods for search strings. It's also ideal to involve an information specialist who has knowledge of qualitative evidence, qualitative methods filters. And then there are also other platforms like Press, where we can peer review our search strategy. And then just also to note that sometimes in qualitative evidence synthesis, finding all studies may be less important than the coverage of geography, language, and context, especially when we are answering questions related to equity, acceptability, and feasibility. So, for example, reviewers may opt to search one key database for each region or language, rather than searching all relevant English databases. And of course, this is a limitation, but as long as the reviewers declare it and justify it, it should be fine. And this leads to the last point, which is about keeping a log of changes and the reasons for actually making those changes. And this is something that is quite important throughout the whole review process. So I just want to stop here and allow for any critical questions. before I continue with the next stage in the review process. Okay, so I'm assuming that there are no questions, and I'll proceed. We'll also allow for questions at the end of the webinar. Okay, it seems like we have a question.
Okay, so we've got one question from Gugu. The question is, so the question is, if a team is working together to search, how do you avoid duplicates? Sorry, we're having sound issues. So thank you, that's a very good question. I think there will always be duplicates, and I think that when you put all the results of the search strategies together, you can put them in a program such as we do, so all the results are put together and duplicates removed. So it's not a problem if there are duplicate search items that are identified in the search. I hope that answers your question, Gugu.
Okay, so I think we'll proceed with the literature search, and I think this is where we'll actually discuss some of the issues that you've just asked, Gugu. So, like in systematic reviews of effectiveness, screening is done in duplicate, and we use tools like Covidence, Rayon, and Excel. It is important to have screening meetings, especially earlier on, to standardize screening, and to also have regular conflict resolution meetings, and to involve a third reviewer when necessary. I just want to ask these. So a typical qualitative evidence synthesis will explore perceptions and experiences of a certain group of participants with regard to a certain phenomenon of interest. And just to mention an example, for example, we are conducting a qualitative evidence synthesis on parents' views, experiences, and or decision-making regarding routine childhood vaccination. And so during title and abstract screening, it was difficult for us to actually gauge whether the perceptions and experiences of the participants of interest whether we can actually separate out their perceptions and experiences from those of other participants who are also included in the primary studies, for example, nurses and doctors. Sometimes in qualitative evidence synthesis, it's also difficult to gauge from the titles and abstracts whether qualitative data is separated out from other data in a mixed method primary study. And so one of the challenges is that it can lead to a high volume of titles and abstracts being included for full text screening. And so the question is then, how can a review team deal with the challenges of high volumes of numbers of full text in the screening process? And at this stage, I just welcome that you please share your suggestions in the chat box. So perhaps just again to repeat the question, how can the review team deal with the challenge of high volume for full text screening? Okay, so sometimes what happens is that the review team can decide to proceed with duplicate screening and maybe just adjust the timelines. So you know you have a high volume of full text and you know that you want to do duplicate screening. So then you just decide that the review might take longer than you had anticipated. Sometimes then the review team can also decide to rather do single screening. So that means that for each full text, only one reviewer will review that full text and just put in place a quality check where you have a second reviewer who can verify the decisions made about the full text with a specific sample. The review team can also decide to sample before full text screening. And sometimes one can also decide to sample after full text screening has taken place. So this is usually then before quality appraisal and data extraction of the included studies. So trying to get us to is to think about sampling and in dealing with large amounts that are eligible for inclusion into the review. In qualitative evidence synthesis, including too many studies can be a threat to thorough analysis of the data. And it's better sometimes to understand a few studies in depth rather than to provide a surface level description of all of the studies. And this is especially important for qualitative evidence syntheses that explore definitions, concepts, and theories of a phenomenon of interest. There are several sampling approaches in the literature, but little is known about their applicability. And so often the most suitable sampling approach only unfolds later on in the review process. And this is usually after the review team has completed at least the first stage of screening, so they have a better sense of the data. So I just want to share a few, 3 examples of sampling approaches that one can use when there are a lot of full text studies that are led into the review. The first approach is called Fearbased sampling. And this is where reviewers select studies that report on important theoretical constructs. And this is usually based on operational definitions of key constructs. So at the beginning of the review, the reviewers would have defined what they think are the key constructs. And so when they sample, they only sample key constructs. Then there's also sampling based on conceptual richness. And this has to do with a degree of analysis and interpretation of the data. For example, a descriptive study using thematic analysis is less conceptually rich than, for example, an ethnographic study where the findings are analyzed in relation to other theories or when new theories emerge. So then the reviewers can decide to only sample studies that scored as 4 or 5. These are the studies that would be more conceptually rich if the question is a conceptual question. So it's really to decide which where to sample, what score to use, or what score to sample, based on what the purpose of the qualitative evidence synthesis is. Then the third example is extreme case sampling, and this is based on selecting studies that are outliers or that have unexpected findings. For example, sampling studies where an intervention was successful in an unlikely setting, or where findings provide an unpopular or an uncommon viewpoint. The next step in the qualitative evidence synthesis process is to assess the methodological quality of included or primary studies. And we usually call this risk of bias assessment in systematic reviews of effectiveness. So before proceeding, I just want to find out why you think it is important to assess the methodological quality of the primary studies or the included studies. And you're welcome to make your suggestions in the chat box. Okay, I'll just proceed. So in summary, I think it's important to evaluate whether the included studies were done in such a manner where we try and minimize bias. We want to determine whether we can trust the study findings when making clinical or policy decisions. We also want to understand the methodological strengths and limitations of the individual studies that we're including in the review. And we want to assess whether analysis and reporting of the study findings was done in a thorough manner. To assess the methodological strengths and limitations of included studies and reviews, the most commonly used tool is called the Critical Appraisal Skills Program Checklist, and it has 10 sections that assess 3 broad issues. It asks questions related to the results of the study and whether they are valid. It asks what the study results are, and it also asks whether the results are applicable locally. And so I've provided a link to the detailed list with the questions and also guidance on how to apply this checklist. And there are other tools for assessing methodological strengths and limitations of included studies as well, which I've also provided. And there's currently a debate as to whether assessing the methodological strengths and limitations of included studies and qualitative evidence synthesis is actually a useful process or not. So it's useful to actually go and look at this tool and see what you think. So practically speaking, when we assess the methodological quality of included studies, this also goes hand in hand with extracting data. And this is just as a reminder, data extraction is when we want to transform the findings in included studies into a format that enables us to actually easily analyze and interpret the findings. And just to note that in addition to sampling, which we've already discussed, data extraction and analysis are complex and time-consuming. And sometimes in qualitative evidence synthesis, it's better for one reviewer to start the data extraction and analysis process alone, and then to discuss a way forward with the rest of the team. And also this depends on the number of studies or the depth of analysis. And it is not always feasible to actually do data extraction and analysis in duplicate. So this is something where qualitative evidence syntheses differ from systematic reviews of effectiveness, where we try and aim to do this step in duplicate. And then also to mention that when we do data extraction, it is best to start off with looking at the logic model that we would have used in developing our review question. And this really helps us to remind ourselves of the key theoretical assumptions that we made at the start about the phenomenon of interest. And this can then also guide the type of analysis approach that we would want to use. And just as a reminder that the logic model is a theory or an explanation of a phenomenon of interest, and it includes the key elements, mechanisms, and processes related to that phenomenon of interest. So in addition to looking at our logic model, we can choose to conduct data extraction where we use the author's own themes. And these are the themes that the authors would have included in the actual primary study. So these are their findings in the primary study. But just to remember that sometimes these themes may not be cross-cutting across our included studies. So we can actually end up with a long list of themes from all the included studies. Another option is that we can use an existing framework. But just to note that a framework may not be able to explain all the data that we have from included studies, and understanding that the framework may be itself a time-consuming process. Then there's also the option where reviewers can create their own themes using a typical inductive thematic analysis approach, and this may require an iterative process just to ensure that there's inter-reviewer agreement. And lastly, we can choose to use a more conceptual approach where the focus is on extracting concepts or theories, and where the reviewers decide that they'll move away from the source data, and that the purpose of this review would then be to really build onto previous or existing concepts and theories. So these approaches that I've touched on are really complex in their own ways, and they represent the different types of questions that a qualitative evidence synthesis can address. And they also show us that there are different levels of analysis and interpretation that can take place. So data extraction will depend on whether the analysis will be at a surface level, whether you just want to provide descriptive findings, or whether it is rich and detailed, where we want to provide more analytical or theory-based findings. So once the synthesis is complete, it is then important for us to assess how confident we can be in the review findings. And it is likely that the users of our evidence, the people who are interested in our qualitative evidence syntheses, be it decision makers or policy makers, will make their own judgments about how much confidence they can place in the findings. So I think it's good practice for us to systematically and transparently assess the confidence of findings during the qualitative evidence synthesis process, so that we don't leave it up to the end user to make their own decisions on that. And for this, so for assessing confidence in qualitative evidence synthesis findings, we use CIRQUAL. For those of you who are familiar with systematic reviews of effectiveness, this is the same thing as the grade tool. And we use it to assess the extent to which an individual finding in the review is the reasonable representation of the phenomenon of interest. CIRQUAL does not assess how well an individual study was conducted. It also does not assess how well a qualitative evidence synthesis was conducted. It assesses and describes the confidence that we can place in findings from a qualitative evidence synthesis. And then just to point out that circle is made up of 4 components. Namely, we assess methodological limitations, which really has to do with things like recruitment, the analysis approach that was used, reflexivity, etc. We also assess coherence, which is about the fit between the underlying data in the primary studies and the review findings that we're presenting. We also assess adequacy, which is the richness of the data and how it can actually provide meaning and what it says about context, and relevance, which is whether the review findings are a reasonable representation of the phenomenon of interest. And for each component, one makes an assessment of whether there are no concerns, whether there are minor concerns, moderate concerns, or serious concerns. And applying circle is complex and probably requires a session on its own, but please have a look at the links. There are 5 papers describing circle and how to apply it and how one can actually make a summary of qualitative findings table. Then once we've gone through all these processes in the qualitative evidence synthesis, we get to the stage where we are writing up our review. And in qualitative evidence synthesis, findings can be presented as themes or arguments or theories. And the key things to consider are to provide a detailed presentation of each of the findings, to add extracts to substantiate the findings. So these are things like quotes or descriptions from the primary study, and also to reference where the evidence comes from. So to make it easy for the reader to be able to go back to the primary studies if they wanted to see where you got certain extracts or certain aspects of your findings from. And then also for each finding, we can include our circle assessment. And this makes it easy for the reader to understand the level of confidence that the reviewers have placed in each of the findings. And then, like any other writing, it's also useful to include a structure. For example, a diagram that can guide the reader. It is easier for a reader to understand the findings when he or she understands how they fit in with a broader phenomenon of interest. It is also ideal to look at published qualitative evidence syntheses that are similar to your review, and this may spark ideas of how you can actually present the findings. In qualitative evidence synthesis, data analysis and write-up are very closely linked, and they usually takes time and several iterations, ensuring that one is consistent and transparent, often as conducting data extraction and analysis, and even circle require more time and actual application. So please use the links provided to read up further on these, and hopefully maybe in the future we can have webinars specifically focusing in on these specific stages. So just in conclusion, I just want to say that qualitative evidence syntheses answer how and why questions. It's really important to publish protocols of qualitative evidence syntheses because this can help others, and it can also advance the methods of this new and growing field. and developing the search strategy is an iterative process, and it's often ideal to get the help of an information specialist. And sometimes there may be a large number of full texts when screening, and sometimes there are many full texts that meet the eligibility criteria, and sampling can be a useful approach where we rather do a thorough analysis of the data than actually doing a very surface level all the possible eligible studies. And then just remember that data extraction, analysis, and write goes from very descriptive to a very analytical level, and that they all depend, to say that Circle can help reviewers and users of qualitative evidence syntheses understand how much confidence to place in the findings. Yeah, and then I'd just like to thank the facilitators of qualitative evidence synthesis that was part of the Global Evidence Synthesis Summit that took place in Cape Town in 2017. Thank you. We'll allow for any questions now. Amir, I think we still have 10 minutes, so we're open to questions.
Thank you, B, for that excellent, lovely presentation. Yeah, if there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, ask B and Sara any questions that you have, or you can also leave them in the chat box below. B, I see there's a question that came through from Dr. Bernard.
So we've got yes. So the question we've got from Dr. Bernard is it possible to combine more than one option for data extraction? Yeah. So I presume so the data extraction and also kind of what the meaning is the analysis. If that makes sense.
And then we have a question from Hawa, whether publishing the protocol is a requirement. So just to answer that first part of the question, no, it's not a requirement. I think it's important to have a protocol just for the sake of the team to be on the same page about what your review is about, how you're going to conduct the review, the methods of the review. And then it's definitely, I think, important to register the review. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're doing a review and duplicating the work of another review team. And that would be an incredible waste of time and resources. And then the second part of the question is whether one can publish the protocol and the QS in the same journal. Yeah, I'm sure that would be allowed for. Yeah, I think yes. I don't think it's mandatory, but I think one can do that, and it might be easier to actually already engage with editors about publishing the protocol, and then them sort of looking forward to you publishing the qualitative evidence synthesis in that journal. Some journals may actually say that they don't publish the protocols, but that they would be interested in publishing the qualitative evidence synthesis when it's conducted.
We have another question from Dina. The question is, can you comment on any types of analysis software that can be used during a quest? Yeah. So yes, the same kinds of software that one would use for a primary qualitative study for the analysis can all be used for qualitative evidence synthesis. So for example, programs such as In Vivo, Atlas TI, there are many others. So those same programs you can use for qualitative evidence synthesis, and more people are using these programs. One doesn't have to, like a primary qualitative research, one can also do things manually or through Excel or Word, but you can also use these qualitative primary study analysis programs. Okay, then we have from Wendy, must qualitative review have a comparison? So the short answer is absolutely not. I would say most qualitative reviews do not have a comparison. Yeah, most would not have a comparison. There can be when you do have a comparison. But it would be less formal evidence synthesis. The comparison is normal kind of care, or not the kind of the intervention that you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps just also to add on to what Sara said, and to say that so Sara's webinar is on our Cochrane website, where she speaks more on formulating a qualitative evidence synthesis question. But with most qualitative review questions, we're not really interested in comparing, but rather interested in how does something work. So why does a particular intervention work, or how does it work, and why do people accept that intervention or not in relation to, for example, a particular condition. So the comparison then becomes less of an important factor in actually a qualitative review question. See, there are more questions coming through.
Okay, we've got a question from Apollo. If a researcher has more than one emerging theme, how does one decide the better theme to follow through? I see, Apollo, this is you're talking about if one is doing, for example, a thematic analysis. I think there are no hard and fast rules with this. I think there are often many themes that will come out of a thematic analysis. And I think one can explore and include all of those themes. I think in terms of what would be a better theme, I suppose it's saying what are the themes that are most prominent, or that comes out most strongly across the studies. But I think with qualitative research, qualitative evidence synthesis, you don't have to pick one particular theme. There can be quite a range of themes and overlapping. I hope that answers your question, Apollo, and one would need more time to talk about the specifics of a thematic analysis to answer your question. We then have a question. Sorry, can people hear me? Please indicate if you cannot hear me at this point. So we have a question from Annalisa. How do you define outcome measures in qualitative evidence syntheses? So these are really your phenomena of interest, and these would be what you are interested in and evaluating. So they are less quantitative, like for a systematic review. So these often vary. They are more to do with experiences, would be an outcome measure, or perceptions, or attitudes. So it would be like with primary qualitative research, the phenomenon of interest there, that your focus for the review, but they are generally qualitative outcome measures.
Okay.
Are there any other
doesn't look like we have any more other questions for today's session. I'd like to thank Bea and Sara for taking all of the questions. I think you guys done an excellent job in answering all of them. And I'd like to also thank all the participants for joining today's webinar and for participating in the activities that we've provided. So please remember that the webinar, the recording will be posted to YouTube. So if you have any colleagues that are interested and that couldn't make today's session, please direct them to Cochrane South Africa, the channel on YouTube. And then also a reminder that the next webinar will be on the 10th of September, and it will be presented by Marrie. So please look out for the email and sign up so that you get a spot on the webinar and that you are not disappointed. If there's anything else from Bea and Sara, is there anything else from you?
No,
Any
just
questions that we may have missed?
for everyone for participating.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you in a month's time. Goodbye.
Bye.
Say bye.
Bye. Thank you very much, Sara and Bea.
Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye.